There's more to life than singing on a Mitch Miller show. I'd rather sing in a back alley with Wally than lose his friendship.
Before Fred Gwynne became Herman Munster, and before a police car became comedy gold, an unlikely TV show was painting patrol cars red to fool New Yorkers, battling diva behavior behind the scenes and referencing Soviet dictators in its catchy theme song. From the actress who played two different characters in one season to the studio that would burn to ashes, the bizarre real-life drama often outdid the on-screen antics. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about Car 54, Where Are You? 1961. Fact 1. Originally titled The Snow Whites.
Gotta do something.
Yeah, let's forget all about it.
Are you kidding? It's a cinch. All we gotta do is switch our day off.
Before Car 54, Where Are You? Became the title that television audiences would remember for decades, the show almost went by a completely different name that would have confused viewers right from the start. The original working title was The Snow Whites, which might seem like an odd choice for a show about bumbling police officers patrolling the streets of the Bronx. The reasoning behind this initial title has been lost to time, but what nearly derailed it is well documented. The show's producers realized they had a serious problem when they discovered that Car 54 was scheduled to air immediately after Disney's Wonderful World of Color on the NBC lineup. With Disney's connection to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs being one of the most famous associations in entertainment history, network executives worried that viewers would be utterly baffled by a police comedy sharing such a similar title with the beloved fairy tale. The potential for audience confusion was simply too great to risk, especially for a brand new series trying to establish its own identity. Faced with this scheduling conflict, the producers needed to come up with a new name quickly, and they found their solution in an unexpected place. The show's theme song had already been written by composer John Strauss and lyricist Nat Hiken, and it told the story of various emergencies and mishaps requiring police assistance throughout the fictional 53rd Precinct. The very last line of that catchy tune posed the question, Car 54, Where Are You? Since the song was already complete and would serve as the show's opening, the producers simply lifted that final line and made it the official title. It was a practical decision born out of necessity that ended up giving the series one of the most memorable and distinctive names in television comedy history. Far better than the generic and confusing title they had started with. Fact 2. Red cars disguised as police vehicles.
All right, Francis, you get that last boom right on the nose.
It's a cinch, Gunther, when you're following a man with perfect pitch.
One of the most fascinating production challenges facing Car 54, Where Are You? Involved making the show's patrol cars look authentic to television audiences while simultaneously ensuring they wouldn't be mistaken for actual police vehicles on the streets of New York City during location filming. The production team came up with what seemed like a clever solution by painting the cars in a distinctive bright red and white color scheme instead of using the traditional dark colors of genuine New York Police Department vehicles. This bold paint job was meant to make it crystal clear to everyone on location that these were television props and not real police cars, which was important for avoiding potential confusion or legal issues with actual law enforcement. However, this careful planning created an ironic and completely unexpected problem that the producers hadn't anticipated when they made their color choice. Since Car 54, Where Are You? Was filmed and broadcast in black and white. As was standard for most television shows in the early 1960s, the bright red paint on the prop cars underwent a dramatic transformation once it passed through the cameras and appeared on television screens across America. The red color, which looked so obviously different in person on the New York streets, registered on black and white film as a dark shade that was virtually indistinguishable from the actual dark paint used on real NYPD patrol cars of that era. This meant that while the production team successfully prevented confusion during filming on location, viewers at home watching their television sets saw cars that looked completely authentic and identical to to actual police vehicles. The irony was perfect. The attempt to make the cars obviously fake in real life resulted in them looking more genuine on screen than if they had simply used actual police car colors from the beginning. Fact 3. 3 different Plymouths played car. 54.
Gunther, what's the matter?
You don't believe nothing about those gypsy curses, do you?
Now don't start believing those crazy
Although television audiences thought they were watching the same patrol car week after week throughout the series, Car 54, Where Are You? Actually used 3 different Plymouth automobiles to portray the title vehicle over the course of its 2-season run. This kind of vehicle rotation was fairly common in television production, but what makes it particularly interesting is how the changes reflected both the show's production timeline and the automotive industry's annual model releases during the early 1960s. When the series premiered in September of 1961, the producers used a 1961 Plymouth Belvedere as the original Car 54, which made perfect sense given that it was the current model year at the time filming began. The Belvedere was a mid-sized car in Plymouth's lineup and provided the right look and interior space needed for filming 2 actors in the front seat along with camera equipment. However, as production continued into the show's 2nd season, the patrol car was replaced with a 1962 Plymouth Savoy, which was actually a slightly lower trim level in Plymouth's hierarchy compared to the Belvedere, but still served the show's purposes perfectly well. This change likely occurred because the newer model was available and the production wanted to maintain a relatively current appearance for the show's vehicles. Later in the series run, a 3rd car was introduced, another Plymouth Savoy, but this time a 1963 model, bringing the show's automotive choices up to date with the latest cars available from Chrysler's Plymouth division. These vehicle changes went largely unnoticed by viewers watching in black and white, since the overall shape and size of Plymouth's cars remained fairly consistent across these model years, and the paint scheme stayed the same regardless of which specific car was being used in any given episode. Fact 4. Ooh, ooh. Was born from forgetfulness.
Oh boy, a picnic with Rose and Al. What fun!
Joe E. Ross's signature catchphrase, "Ooh, ooh," became one of the most recognizable vocal trademarks in television comedy. But it wasn't the result of clever script writing or careful character development. Instead, this famous exclamation was born purely out of Ross's genuine struggle with remembering his lines, turning a professional weakness into an iconic strength. Ross had developed a reputation throughout his career for having tremendous difficulty memorizing dialogue, which created constant challenges on every production he worked on. When he found himself in front of the camera, unable to recall what he was supposed to say next, he would instinctively make that distinctive "ooh, ooh" sound as a nervous stall tactic while his mind scrambled to recover the forgotten words. This wasn't a performance choice, it was a real moment of panic and confusion that happened to come across as endearing and funny rather than awkward. The origins of this catchphrase actually trace back even earlier than Car 54, to Ross's work on The Phil Silvers Show, where he played Sergeant Rupert Ritzick. Phil Silvers himself recognized the comedic potential in Ross's line-reading difficulties and would deliberately feed him incorrect cues or change things up unexpectedly during filming. These intentional sabotages would genuinely confuse Ross, and his authentic "ooh, ooh" reaction, complete with a bewildered expression, proved so hilarious that it became a regular part of his character. By the time Ross landed the role of Officer Gunther Tootie on Car 54, Where Are You?, the sound had become so associated with his comedic persona that it was deliberately written into the show as an official character trait. What had started as an embarrassing admission of his inability to remember lines had transformed into his most valuable professional asset, proving that sometimes the best comedy comes not from what's written on the page, but from genuine human moments of confusion and vulnerability. Fact 5. Joe E. Ross nearly got fired.
We fix her sink.
Fixed her sink. I'll have to take care of this myself. Sir.
Behind the scenes of Car 54, Where Are You? Creator and producer Nat Hiken faced a serious dilemma that almost changed the entire trajectory of the show. Joe E. Ross's behavior during production had become so problematic and disruptive that Hiken reached a breaking point and made the difficult decision to fire his co-lead actor. Ross's issues went far beyond his well-known inability to memorize lines, extending into unprofessional conduct that was affecting the entire production's ability to function efficiently. Hiken had already developed a plan for how to restructure the show after Ross's departure, which involved promoting Al Lewis from his recurring role to become Fred Gwynne's new partner and co-star, giving the series a fresh dynamic while maintaining its core concept. This would have been a significant shakeup for a show that had built its identity around the chemistry between Gwynne's straight-man Officer Muldoon and Ross's dim-witted Officer Tootie. However, when Hiken actually confronted Ross with the termination, something unexpected happened that changed everything. Ross, faced with losing his role on a successful network television show, completely broke down emotionally and began crying in front of Hiken. This raw display of vulnerability and desperation apparently touched something in the producer's heart, because despite all the legitimate reasons he had for wanting Ross gone, and despite having a solid backup plan already in place, Hiken ultimately couldn't go through with the firing. He relented and allowed Ross to stay on the show for the remainder of its run. Looking back, some television historians have suggested that this moment of compassion may have actually hurt the show's long-term prospects. Ross's continued presence and ongoing behavioral issues likely contributed to Hiken's eventual exhaustion and burnout, which played a role in his decision to end the series after just 2 seasons rather than continuing what could have been a much longer run. Fact 6. Hookers as dialogue coaches.
Forget who he is. I forget what he said.
Sing.
Joe E. Ross's personal life was as colorful and controversial as his on-screen persona, with behavior that would be absolutely unthinkable on a modern television production. During the filming of Car 54, Where Are You?, Ross regularly had prostitutes visiting him in his dressing room between takes, treating the studio lot as if it were his personal entertainment venue rather than a professional workplace. This wasn't a secret that Ross tried to hide from his colleagues. In fact, he was remarkably open about these visits, once introducing one of these women to other cast or crew members as his dialogue coach, which was a joke that carried a particularly sharp irony given his notorious and well-documented inability to actually learn his lines. The absurdity of claiming that someone he was paying for sexual services was somehow helping him with his script memorization, his greatest professional weakness, apparently struck Ross as funny rather than embarrassing. This behavior was part of a larger pattern in Ross's personal life that reflected his attitudes and choices regarding relationships with women. Over the course of his life, Ross was married 8 times, which would be remarkable enough on its own. But what made this marital history even more unusual was that all 8 of his wives were formerly working as sex workers when he met them. This consistent pattern suggests that Ross specifically sought out relationships with women in this profession, whether out of comfort, familiarity, or some other personal preference. His openness about these relationships and his willingness to bring this aspect of his private life directly into his professional environment demonstrates just how different the culture and standards of television production were in the early 1960s compared to today, when such behavior would likely result in immediate termination and possible legal consequences. Fact 7. The Biograph studio burned down.
7 violations.
They sure pile up on you.
Gunther, this is serious. We gotta crack down.
The physical location where Car 54, Where Are You?, created all of its interior scenes eventually met a tragic and destructive fate years after the show had finished production. The series filmed its indoor sets at a studio facility located at 807 East 175th Street in the Bronx, which had a long and notable history in the entertainment industry. This building had originally been home to the Biograph Company, one of the pioneering film studios from the silent movie era, giving it significant historical importance in the development of American cinema. For Car 54, this Bronx location served as the production home where the precinct interior, the officers' homes, and all other indoor scenes were constructed and filmed, while outdoor location shooting took place on actual New York City streets. The studio continued to serve various production purposes for years after Car 54 wrapped its final episode in 1963, housing other projects and maintaining its role as a working facility in New York's film and television industry. However, in 1980, nearly 2 decades after Officer Tootie and Officer Muldoon had last patrolled their fictional beat, disaster struck the historic building. A devastating fire swept through the structure at 807 East 175th Street, destroying the facility that had once housed both silent film history and one of television's most beloved comedies. The building was damaged beyond repair or restoration, and eventually the entire site was completely cleared. Today, if you visit that address in the Bronx, you won't find any trace of the studio where Car 54's interior magic was created. Instead, the location is now occupied by a New York City Department of Sanitation garage, a purely functional municipal building that serves an important but decidedly unglamorous purpose. It's a rather fitting irony that a facility that once created entertainment about bumbling city workers is now actually being used by real city workers, though these ones deal with garbage trucks rather than patrol cars. Fact 8. Fred Gwynne was Harvard Lampoon president.
Aren't you planning on talking to him about police work?
Of course, but not while we're on duty.
Long before Fred Gwynne became famous as Officer Francis Muldoon on Car 54, Where Are You?, and later as Herman Munster on The Munsters, he had already established himself as a talented creative force at one of America's most prestigious universities. While attending Harvard University, Gwynne didn't just participate in the famous Harvard Lampoon humor magazine. He rose to become its president, leading one of the country's most influential college comedy publications. Beyond his leadership role, Gwynne also served as an in-house cartoonist for the Lampoon, demonstrating early on the artistic talents that would later serve him well in his acting career, as he was known for being able to sketch and draw throughout his life. His time at the Lampoon put him at the center of Harvard's comedy scene and connected him with other creative minds who would go on to influential careers in entertainment and media. During his tenure with the publication, Gwynne was involved in one particularly memorable controversy that showed both his wit and his willingness to defend artistic expression. When a district attorney attempted to ban the Harvard Lampoon for publishing material he deemed obscene, Gwynne responded with characteristic humor and intelligence. Rather than becoming defensive or apologetic, he quipped that this attempted censorship actually proves moral standards in New England are higher than elsewhere, cleverly turning the accusation back on the accuser by suggesting that what might be considered offensive in puritanical New England would be perfectly acceptable in other parts of the country. This combination of intelligence, creativity, and quick wit that Gwynne displayed at Harvard would serve him well throughout his acting career, allowing him to bring depth and nuance to comedic roles that might have been one-dimensional in less capable hands. His educational background and experience in comedy writing and cartooning gave him a unique perspective on humor that helped him elevate every character he played beyond what was simply written on the script page. Fact 9. Al Lewis played 3 different characters.
Right away, we paint the whole place. We clean out the files.
Kissel, you and the clerks get all the paperwork right up the minute.
Sal Lewis's journey to becoming Officer Leo Schnauzer, one of the regular characters at the fictional 53rd Precinct, took an unusual and somewhat confusing path that would be highly unlikely to happen in modern television production. Before Lewis was brought on as a series regular, he had already appeared in 2 early episodes of Car 54, Where Are You?, as a guest star. But here's where things get interesting. In both of those guest appearances, Lewis played a character named Al Spencer, which might sound like the same role appearing twice, except that the two Al Spencers had completely different occupations and were clearly meant to be entirely different people who just happened to share the same name. This kind of casting decision might seem sloppy or confusing by today's standards, where maintaining continuity is considered essential, but in the early 1960s, television was still developing many of the conventions that would later become standard practice. Audiences at the time were more forgiving of such inconsistencies, and the episodic nature of most shows meant that viewers weren't expected to remember minor guest characters from week to week anyway. Then, later in that same first season, the producers apparently decided that Lewis had enough chemistry with the cast and enough comedic talent to warrant bringing him back as a permanent addition to the show. However, rather than simply having one of his previous Al Spencer characters join the police force, which might have provided at least some continuity, the show introduced him as Officer Leo Schnauzer, a completely new character with no connection to either of the previous roles Lewis had played. This meant that within the span of a single season, Lewis had portrayed three entirely different characters on the same show, all of them appearing in the same setting of the 53rd Precinct, yet none of them acknowledged or connected to each other in any way, creating a truly bizarre situation that only worked because viewers were willing to accept these kinds of inconsistencies as part of the television experience. Fact 10. The theme song references Khrushchev.
It's that other Aleutian ceremonial chair.
I was walking home from bowling, and I passed this stall, and I looked in the window.
The catchy theme song for Car 54, Where Are You?, contains a fascinating historical reference that ties the show directly to one of the most significant geopolitical moments of the early 1960s. Among the various emergencies and situations mentioned in the lyrics, the song includes the memorable line, Khrushchev's due at Idlewild, which references real events that were very fresh in the minds of American audiences when the show premiered. Nikita Khrushchev was the leader of the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War, making him one of the most important and controversial political figures in the world at that time. In September of 1960, just about a year before Car 54 made its television debut, Khrushchev made a highly publicized and politically significant visit to New York City to attend a meeting of the United Nations General Assembly. This wasn't just any diplomatic visit. It was a major international event that dominated news coverage and required massive security preparations throughout the city. The Soviet leader arrived at Idlewild Airport, which was the original name for what would later be renamed John F. Kennedy International Airport after the president's assassination in 1963. Khrushchev's visit to New York was memorable for several reasons beyond just the diplomatic importance, including his famous shoe-banging incident at the United Nations, where he allegedly removed his shoe and banged it on his desk to show his displeasure during a debate, though the exact details of that incident remain somewhat disputed by historians. By including this reference in the theme song, the show's creators, Nat Hiken and John Strauss, were tapping into a recent event that every American viewer would immediately recognize and understand, giving the song a contemporary relevance and edge that helped ground the comedy in the real world of New York City policing. The fact that this line has remained in the theme song for decades, long after most people forgot about Khrushchev's specific visit, gives the show an interesting time capsule quality that helps modern viewers understand the political and cultural context of the early 1960s. Fact 11. The 1994 movie was filmed as a musical.
About the Christmas party and let Leo go on?
Shut up.
Hasn't the guy a right to his opinion? What is this, rut?
The 1994 film adaptation of Car 54, Where Are You?, has earned a reputation as one of the worst movies ever made, but the troubled production history reveals that what audiences eventually saw in theaters was drastically different from what was originally filmed. The movie was actually shot way back in 1990, a full 4 years before it would finally limp into theaters, and the original version was conceived and filmed as a full-fledged musical comedy with multiple song and dance numbers throughout the film. This creative choice to transform the property into a musical represented a significant departure from the original television series, which had never featured any musical numbers beyond its iconic theme song. However, at some point during the long post-production process, someone made the decision that the musical elements weren't working, and most of these carefully choreographed and expensively produced musical sequences were cut from the film entirely during the editing process. This left behind a confused and disjointed movie that had been structured around musical numbers that no longer existed, creating pacing problems and narrative gaps that made the final product even more incoherent than it might have been otherwise. But the missing musical numbers were only one of the problems plaguing this doomed production. After filming wrapped in 1990, the movie sat on the shelf unreleased for 4 long years. Not because the studio was trying to perfect it or waiting for the right release date, but because Orion Pictures, the company that had produced the film, went bankrupt and entered into a prolonged financial crisis that prevented them from distributing their completed movies. When Car 54, Where Are You?, finally did get released to theaters in 1994, it was a complete disaster at the box office, earning only about $1.2 million during its entire theatrical run, which was an absolutely catastrophic financial failure that didn't even come close to covering a fraction of what the movie had cost to produce. Fact 12. NBC ownership demand killed the show.
Thursday!
You don't have to talk to him. You just try to keep me from doing something stupid.
Despite the fact that Car 54, Where Are You?, was performing quite well in the ratings and had built a loyal audience, the show came to an abrupt end after only 2 seasons due to a combination of business conflicts and creative exhaustion that prevented it from continuing. During its first season in 1961 to 1962, the show actually placed 20th in the overall ratings, which was a respectable performance for a new comedy series and suggested that it had the potential for a long and successful run. However, when it came time to negotiate for a 3rd season, NBC executives threw a curveball into the discussions by demanding that the network receive partial ownership of the show as a condition for renewal. This was becoming an increasingly common practice as networks realized that owning the shows they aired would be far more profitable in the long run than simply buying them from independent producers, because ownership would give them control over syndication rights and merchandising opportunities for years to come. Creator and producer Nat Hiken, who maintained ownership and creative control of Car 54, flatly refused to give NBC any ownership stake in his show, standing firm on his principles even though it meant risking the show's future. Meanwhile, the show's sponsor, the consumer goods giant Procter & Gamble, attempted to find a solution by shopping the series to CBS to see if they would be willing to pick it up for a 3rd season without demanding ownership. But these negotiations ultimately fell through, and no deal could be reached. However, the business conflicts weren't the only factor in Hiken's decision to end the show. By the end of the 2nd season, Hiken was completely exhausted from the tremendous workload he had taken on, as he was not only the show's creator and main writer, but also directed many episodes and handled numerous other production responsibilities. Adding to his stress was the constant challenge of dealing with Joe E. Ross's behavioral problems and unprofessionalism on set, which had worn Hiken down over 2 years of production. The combination of all these factors led Hiken to make the decision to walk away from Car 54, Where Are You? Entirely. And he never worked on another television series for the rest of his career. Fact 13. Fred Gwynne's mother created Sonny Jim.
Excuse me, Captain. When you said all your antiques,
You meant accept your pride and joy, that Aleutian.
Fred Gwynne came from a family with its own significant place in American cultural history. Though his mother's accomplishments in the commercial art world are far less remembered today than her son's acting career. Before she married and became Dorothy Ficken Gwynne, Fred's mother worked as a successful commercial illustrator during an era when that field was just beginning to recognize the power of cartoon characters and mascots in advertising and marketing. Her most notable and historically important creation was a character called Sonny Jim, who holds the distinction of being recognized as the very first cereal mascot in American advertising history. She created this cheerful character for a breakfast cereal called Force, which was one of the early ready-to-eat cereals competing in a market that was just beginning to boom in the early years of the 20th century. The character of Sonny Jim was designed to be an appealing and memorable face for the product, helping to build brand loyalty and recognition at a time when such marketing concepts were still relatively new and innovative. While Force cereal itself has long since disappeared from store shelves and Sonny Jim has been largely forgotten by modern consumers, the concept that Dorothy Ficken Gwynne helped pioneer, using a friendly cartoon character to represent and sell a cereal brand, became one of the most enduring and successful strategies in food marketing history. Today, cereal mascots are so ubiquitous and such an expected part of the breakfast cereal industry that it's hard to imagine a time when they didn't exist. But someone had to create that first one, and that someone was Fred Gwynne's mother. This creative and artistic background in the Gwynne family may have influenced Fred's own artistic inclinations, as he was known throughout his life not just as an actor, but also as a talented illustrator and author who wrote and illustrated several children's books after his acting career had made him famous. Fact 14. The show reunited for the Munsters.
Right away. Maybe we can solve this case before Checkmate comes on. Then we can work on that one, too. Gunther.
The comedic partnership between Fred Gwynne and Al Lewis that had made Car 54, Where Are You? Such an enjoyable show didn't end when the series wrapped production in 1963. In fact, their on-screen chemistry was so natural and effective that it directly led to both actors being cast together again in what would become an even more famous and enduring television series. When CBS began developing the Munsters for the 1964 television season, the casting directors and producers were looking for actors who could bring warmth and humor to characters that were essentially parodies of classic movie monsters, living as a typical American suburban family. Having just finished working together on Car 54 the previous year, Gwynne and Lewis were fresh in the minds of television executives and producers who had seen firsthand how well the two actors played off each other and how their contrasting styles, Gwynne's tall, gentle, straight man approach and Lewis's shorter, more energetic, eccentric characterization, created a perfect comedic dynamic. Both actors were immediately recruited for the Munsters, with Gwynne taking on the lead role of Herman Munster, the lovable Frankenstein's monster-inspired father of the family, while Lewis was cast as Grandpa, the vampire patriarch who lived with the family and was constantly cooking up schemes and inventions in the dungeon laboratory beneath their cobweb-covered Victorian mansion. The decision to reunite them proved to be brilliant casting, as the Munsters ran for 2 seasons and 70 episodes from 1964 to 1966, and became one of the most beloved sitcoms of the 1960s, achieving a level of cultural impact and lasting popularity that actually surpassed Car 54, Where Are You? In terms of syndication success and public recognition. The friendship and professional rapport that Gwynne and Lewis had built during their time on Car 54 translated seamlessly into their work on the Munsters, and the two remained close friends for the rest of their lives, often appearing together at fan conventions and nostalgia events decades later. Fact 15. A real police department dropped Car 54 the...
Lucille? My Lucille?
Yes, what is it, Gunther? I have to go take my face off.
Don't!
Impact of Car 54, Where Are You? Extended beyond television screens and into the real world of actual law enforcement in ways that the show's creators probably never anticipated or intended. When the series premiered in 1961 and began its successful run on NBC, police departments across the country were suddenly faced with an unexpected consequence of the show's popularity. Officers and departments found themselves being teased and mocked by members of the public who associated the bumbling, incompetent fictional characters of Officer Tootie and Officer Muldoon with real police work. Nowhere was this problem more acute than in Dayton, Ohio, where the police department made a decision that perfectly illustrates how seriously they took this issue. The Dayton Police Department actually had a patrol car designated as Car 54 in their fleet before the television show premiered, which was just an unfortunate coincidence since police departments across America numbered their vehicles sequentially, and many of them had cars in the 50s as part of their normal numbering system. However, once the show became popular and people started making jokes and comments whenever they saw or heard about Car 54 on the streets of Dayton, the department decided they had had enough. Rather than continuing to deal with the constant teasing, wisecracks, and diminished respect that seemed to come with operating a vehicle that shared its number with television's most incompetent police officers, the Dayton Police Department made the official decision to drop Car 54 from their fleet entirely. This wasn't just a matter of renumbering one vehicle, it meant that they essentially retired that number from use to avoid any association with the television show. The fact that a real police department felt compelled to take such action speaks to both the popularity and cultural penetration of Car 54, Where Are You? During its original run, as well as to the sensitivity that law enforcement agencies felt about their public image during an era when respect for police authority was considered essential to effective law enforcement.